I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for a crosswalk signal. I share my location with my sister and mom. I stay alert in public places and try not to linger after getting into my car. If I had been more diligent about that last rule, maybe I wouldn't have found myself in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from covering a late shift for my friend, so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store is in a secluded part of town, but I'd never felt unsafe there. However, I had never visited it so late at night before. As soon as I stepped out of the store with my groceries, the elderly cashier locked up the shop and turned off all the building's lights. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to spend too much time in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often runs errands after dark. Maybe it was hunger, or maybe it was because my house hadn't felt comforting since my breakup a few weeks ago. Either way, I wasn't in a hurry to go home. I opened an episode of The Terror on my phone and got ready to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of complete silence before the night was suddenly shattered by a scream. I lifted my head from my phone, startled to see a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms frantically at me. My car was parked directly in front of the store, facing the building, with only a narrow sidewalk separating us. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was as if she had emerged from the brick wall itself. She circled my car and stopped beside the driver's window. Then she started pointing downward, the universal sign for roll down your window. No chance, I thought to myself. Even though she looked well-dressed and sane, I had no idea what her intentions were. In fact, I felt relieved that I always lock my car doors the moment I get inside. The woman, perhaps realizing that I had no intention of opening my door, then said something that no one ever wants to hear. "Hey," she shouted, "there's someone in your back seat." My throat went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes flashed through my mind. I could feel the piano wire tightening around my neck or the cold barrel of a gun pressing against my forehead. I unbuckled my seatbelt and prepared to throw myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew that I was aware of them, would I have enough time to escape? I placed my hand on the door handle and glanced at my rearview mirror, where I saw nothing. My car is a small hatchback, meaning there isn't much room for someone to hide in the cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone when checking the mirror. My terror slowly faded, replaced by overwhelming confusion. I turned in my seat, scanned the interior, and confirmed beyond a doubt there was no one in the back seat. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was now barely a foot away from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. I heard a few more deep clicks as she tried, unsuccessfully, to open the locked door. I lifted my gaze to her, and she gave me a strange smile, as if we were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at her face. Her skin was stretched tightly over her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they had been carved onto her. Her eyes were deep-set and oval, and her teeth seemed far too small yet unnervingly numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment of shock at the eerie face before me, then threw my car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot. For a few unsettling seconds, the woman clung to the door handle, keeping pace with my backward motion. But thankfully, she soon let go, and I drove away, my mind racing with a chilling realization. She had been trying to lure me out of my car. What disturbed me even more was the fact that her plan had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I hadn't seen, and what exactly she had wanted from me. I hoped that I had narrowly escaped a robbery, rather than something far more sinister. I reached my home 20 minutes later. Still shaken from the encounter, I rushed inside and made sure all my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little to calm my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. And when I finally fell asleep, my fears followed me into my dreams. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that I was jolted awake a few hours later by the sound of frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming. My alarm clock read 4:17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door, unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the intensity of the pounding, seemed likely. Slowly, I got out of bed and cautiously made my way toward the entryway. I had never been in a situation like this before and had no idea how to react. I didn't smell smoke, thankfully, but that didn't mean everything was okay. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling my name in a questioning tone. It sounded somewhat familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who's there?" I called out. "Brian," the mysterious voice answered, and I felt a wave of relief. Brian was my neighbor. He lived in the house directly across the street from mine. We weren't exactly close, but I saw him often, walking around the neighborhood with his dog, Billy. I turned on the entryway light, but since I was still in my pajamas, I didn't want to open the door unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, I called out to him from inside, "What's wrong?" "Well," he began. I heard his voice crack before he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" "What?" I asked, my heartbeat quickening. "No, I don't. Why do you ask?" "Well, I was in the yard with the dog because he needed to go out. And while I was there, I thought I saw someone in your front window. Someone who didn't look quite right." I froze in place, feeling as if I were trapped in a horrible nightmare. Slowly, I turned around and glanced down the dark hallway, wishing I had turned on more lights on my way to the door. "She followed you home," I thought. "She's in the house with you right now." I was ready to bolt outside into the cold, but by some miracle I had just enough presence of mind to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something wasn't right. I took a step back from the door. "Are you okay, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he spoke next, his voice sounded slightly different, as if he were testing out a new tone. "Of course. I just caught a little cold, but I still wanted to check on you." My voice wavered as I asked him a question. "But your dog, isn't she a girl?" Brian didn't respond. The silence stretched, suffocating me, as my mind spiraled into panic, trying to determine whether the real threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It twisted downward as far as the lock would allow, then rattled as the person on the other side tugged at it. This happened several more times as they tested the lock. Then, there was a powerful bang, as if someone had slammed into the door with all their strength. And then, silence again. I stood frozen for another minute. I had no peephole, but I mustered the courage to walk into the living room and peek through the blinds at my front yard. In the distance, on the sidewalk, a figure was walking away from my house. I couldn't make out the face, but something deep inside me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched them disappear into the quiet night. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I spent my time thinking, replaying the night's events over and over. The most logical explanation was that I had been dreaming. After all, I had nearly fallen for a trick meant to lure me out of my car just hours before, so it made sense that I would have a nightmare about a similar situation. And yet, I had never in my entire life had a dream that vivid. Maybe, somehow, the woman really did follow me home. She could have easily placed a tracker on my car. But how, in the name of all that's rational, did she know Brian's name? And how had she mimicked his voice so perfectly? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day, too haunted by the idea that someone, or perhaps multiple people, are trying to lure me outside. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel like I catch glimpses of the woman in my peripheral vision. Her beady eyes, her eerie smile. My wife, Lynn, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Throughout our relationship, everything has been completely normal, and I never noticed any strange behavior or warning signs at all. Lynn is a kind, intelligent, and very considerate person. She has always been serious and is not the type to act childishly or try to scare me. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror films. But she got so scared that she couldn't even make it halfway through before we had to turn it off. She's not interested in anything scary and has never been a fan of pranks. It's just not her thing. That's what made this so strange, because it simply wasn't in her nature. She has never had any psychological issues, and as far as I know, there's no history of such problems in her family. Otherwise, I would have found out during the 6 years I've been with her. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself a cup of coffee before heading to work. I was running a little late that morning and knew I wouldn't have time to stop at Dunkin' Donuts for my usual coffee. I took a sip as I hurried down the hallway toward the front door when I noticed Lynn peeking at me from behind the corner ahead. I could only see her eyes and a strand of her long, dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was hidden behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee in surprise, but instead, I just ended up burning my lip badly. "Oh my God, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee off my pants. "You scared the hell out of me." She immediately pulled back out of sight, like a child caught doing something mischievous. I heard her run toward the living room, and by the time I reached the front door, she was completely out of sight. It was so weird and completely out of character for her, as I said, but I also found it kind of funny. She was just being playful in a way she normally wasn't. I called out that I loved her and jokingly called her crazy. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. It was a little odd, but definitely not something that required calling a priest. I had forgotten about it by lunchtime, and when I got home, Lynn was back to her usual self. I didn't mention it, and neither did she. Life went on as normal. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get something to drink. I was standing by the kitchen counter holding a bottle of orange juice when I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. For some reason, I looked down and saw my wife's face staring up at me with a smile. She was peeking at me from the other side of the table, her eyes wide and unblinking, grinning like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. I screamed, I admit it. Not out of anger, but out of fear. For some reason, I felt absolute terror in that moment. As soon as I screamed, Lynn quickly scurried backward, disappearing from sight, her hands and feet slapping against the tile floor as she scrambled out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't chase after her. I didn't call out to her. I just stood there, frozen in shock, wondering what the hell had just happened. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but eventually I did. When I got to the bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to see if she was really asleep. I had this feeling that the moment I got into bed she would jump at me, but she didn't. I slid under the covers, and she didn't move at all. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I waited until she came downstairs for coffee. After handing her a cup and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was going on last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light so I wouldn't embarrass or upset her. She frowned as she sipped her coffee, shaking her head like she had no idea what I was talking about. "You were peeking at me again. From over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor beside the kitchen table. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she burst into laughter. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but laugh along with her. "You know, you scare me sometimes," I said. She laughed even more, then set her cup down on the table and wrapped her arms around my neck. "And you scare me all the time, so I guess we're even," she joked. We said our goodbyes and went to work. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it was to see her smiling at me like that from behind the table. The sound of her hand slapping against the floor as she crawled away. I convinced myself she was just trying to be playful, maybe even trying to share my love for all things creepy. It wasn't that I was afraid of her, but something about it felt deeply unsettling. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she would peer at me from behind the couch or the living room curtains. Once, she even managed to squeeze herself into her grandmother's old trunk, the one that sat at the foot of our bed. I wouldn't have even known she was there if the trunk's old hinges hadn't given her away. She had barely lifted the lid, just enough for half of her face to peek through the gap. She was smiling like an excited child. It was disturbing. I didn't even know what to say. I just stared at her. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why she was doing this. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly closed the lid and locked herself inside the trunk. I walked away, feeling deeply uneasy. I didn't understand why she was acting like this, but she seemed happy doing it. I just hoped she would get bored of this game soon. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she had finally given up on her strange little prank, and I felt relieved. One night, while we were watching a show on Netflix, I jokingly mentioned that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately. It seemed like she had finally given up on her little spy game. She looked at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I just got better at it." I didn't say anything, but I seriously wondered if she was joking or not. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't paying attention and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of it? I started feeling paranoid, constantly checking to see if she was watching me from behind a corner or peeking from behind a door. I would jump at the slightest sound whenever I was home and couldn't see her clearly. I felt stupid, like I was going crazy. But after a few more weeks without another incident, I started to relax. I stopped checking the furniture and walls, convincing myself that it had all just been a weird memory. Then, a few days ago, things took a terrifying turn. Lynn had left to visit one of her friends, and I was relaxing on the couch, playing some games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I decided to take a shower. As I was rinsing the soap from my hair, I felt that horrible sensation, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and I nearly had a heart attack from pure terror. Lynn was peeking at me from behind the shower curtain. She had stuck her entire head inside while keeping the rest of her body outside. Her long, dark hair draped over the curtain, its ends dripping water. Her mouth was stretched into a horrible grin, and her wide, bloodshot eyes stared at me without blinking, as if she hadn't in a long time. I screamed and jumped backward, slamming into the wall, but she didn't move, she didn't flinch. Her smile never changed. Her makeup had smeared down her cheeks in 2 black streaks, making her look completely deranged. I was absolutely terrified. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, neither of us saying a word. Then, finally, she slowly pulled her head back out. Through the blurry shower curtain, I saw her distorted silhouette retreating toward the bathroom door. A second later, the door slammed shut with such force that the mirror shook. I screamed again and leapt out of the shower, rushing to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Some might think I overreacted, but whether it was a joke or not, I wasn't willing to put up with this madness anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced back and forth in the bathroom, stopping every now and then to listen at the door. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound. Pressing my ear against the door, I strained to listen. I heard nothing, but I imagined Lynn standing just on the other side, quietly laughing at her prank. A wave of anger surged through me. I was furious that I had been made to feel afraid in my own home, that I had been forced to hide in the bathroom for an entire hour. And for what? A joke? If it was a joke, it was the worst one ever. "What the hell, Lynn?" I yelled angrily. "This is seriously getting annoying." I waited for her to apologize, or at least call me a jerk, but instead, I heard a faint whimper, so soft I wasn't even sure if I had actually heard it. Then, silence. "Lynn?" I called out, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. No response, just the sound of my own heavy breathing. "For God's sake, stop this crap!" I shouted, pounding the door with my fist. I expected her to yell back at me, furious that I had raised my voice at her like that. I had never shouted at her that way before, but there was nothing. No sound except the dripping of water from the shower head. I won't lie, I was scared, terrified of opening the door and facing my wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like an eternity when you're terrified. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in the bathroom. Dropping to my knees, I peeked under the door. I half expected to see her face staring back at me from beneath it, but thankfully, there was nothing. I could see the entire hallway leading up to the top of the stairs, but Lynn wasn't there. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. I stared for a few moments, waiting to see if her head would slowly appear at the top of the stairs. But it never did. Standing up, I hovered my hand over the doorknob, trying to prepare myself to open it. With trembling fingers, I turned the lock. I was just about to pull the door open when I heard a sound that makes me sick every time I remember it. A low whimper, louder than before, but this time I could tell exactly where it was coming from. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet door, my eyes meeting my wife's as she watched me through a narrow gap. Her eyes were still unnervingly wide, her mouth stretched into the most grotesque grin I had ever seen. I couldn't even scream. I was too terrified to make a sound. Her hands were clasped tightly against her chest, and her body trembled with intense excitement, as if she could barely contain herself. A quiet, raspy whimper escaped her throat, deep and rough, sending chills crawling down my spine. I don't know how I found the strength to yank open the bathroom door and bolt down the stairs as fast as I could, grabbing my keys and phone from the living room table before sprinting outside to my car. I could hear her sharp laughter echoing behind me, but she wasn't following. I didn't bother closing the front door. I drove away from the house faster than the law allowed, shaking the entire time, whether from fear, cold, or both. I hadn't grabbed a coat, I hadn't even put on shoes. I was still in just my underwear, and my hair was still wet. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring all the calls and texts flooding my phone. I didn't check it until I was safely parked in his driveway. Lynn had called me 4 times and sent a barrage of messages, asking where I had gone and why I had left like that. I tossed my phone onto the dashboard, furious at how casual she sounded. Chris and his wife were stunned to see me, especially since I was standing there in nothing but my underwear, but they told me I could stay as long as I needed. Chris gave me some clothes and asked what had happened. I told him I had a fight with Lynn, but I didn't go into details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting or that I'd abandoned my wife over a prank, no matter how bizarre it was. Hadn't I been encouraging her for years to be more playful instead of so serious all the time? I wanted her to relax and loosen up a bit, but this was definitely not what I meant. I tried to sleep on Chris's couch, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Just knowing she had been in there with me the whole time sent chills down my spine. She had never left the bathroom. Instead, she had slipped into the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to trick me. The thought of going back home made my stomach twist with anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Eventually, Chris gave me a sleeping pill, which helped me get a little bit of rest. But my sleep was filled with nightmares, horrible ones, all of them about Lynn's smiling face. I woke up with the sunrise, my body stiff and sore from the couch, feeling utterly exhausted. I knew I would have to call Lynn at some point, but I had no idea what to say to her. I wasn't going back home unless she promised me she would never pull any terrifying stunts again. I just wanted my wife back the way she used to be. Her usual serious expression had never been more comforting than it was now. I was thinking about calling her and telling her that when I felt that familiar sensation again, I was being watched. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding violently. I didn't want to look away, but the more I ignored the feeling, the worse it became. My eyes were drawn away from the ceiling as if they moved on their own. Her face was pressed against the window beside the couch, staring at me with that same wide grin. Drool dripped from her lips, leaving 2 long streaks on the glass. I had no idea how long she had been there, but something told me she had been standing there for a while, maybe all night. I didn't scream, even though I was terrified, but anger overpowered any fear I felt in that moment. I jumped up from the couch and slammed my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you insane? What's wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now!" She didn't move. Her eerie expression never changed. If anything, her grin seemed to stretch even wider, as if she had never been happier. I heard Chris and his wife stirring upstairs. It was as if Lynn heard them too, because her head tilted slightly in their direction, and she slowly began to close her mouth. Chris called my name from above, his voice clearly laced with concern. I turned and saw him and Rebecca rushing down the stairs. But when I looked back at the window, Lynn was gone. The only evidence that she had ever been there was the 2 trails of saliva still sliding down the glass. I tried to explain to Chris and Rebecca what had happened. I told them I woke up to find Lynn watching me through their window. But they were skeptical, and who could blame them? Chris and I went outside to check the area in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight depression. Probably an animal, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I had dreamed the whole thing, but they didn't understand, and I didn't have the energy to explain. I called my workplace and told them I wouldn't be coming in that day, then turned off my phone. I didn't want to face Lynn. Even talking to her was more than I could handle at that moment. I was truly beginning to believe that something was irreversibly wrong with her, and that no matter what promises she made, we would never go back to how we used to be. That thought saddened me deeply. I spent most of the morning crying. By noon, I decided I was ready to confront her, to give her one last chance to explain herself. After 6 years together, I at least owed her that, or so I told myself. When I turned my phone back on, I found dozens of messages from her, all from a wife who sounded worried. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And many more messages like that, all telling me how much she loved me, how much she wanted me to come back, and how worried she was. But she never mentioned any of her insane behavior, as if she hadn't been acting like something out of a Stephen King novel. Even her texting style was different. Normally, she would send me long messages just to ask me to pick up a loaf of bread. I expected her to have something more to say, after everything she had done. I know my reaction might seem childish to some of you looking at this story from the outside, but if you had seen the way she looked at me, how she ran on all fours like a wild animal, how she grinned at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, you'd understand that my reaction was completely justified. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. When I woke up yesterday, it was already past noon, and thankfully, I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. As Rebecca prepared sandwiches for lunch, she tried to bring up the topic without seeming intrusive. I don't want to pry because it's not my place, but is this something you two can fix? I thought for a moment, carefully choosing my words. I wasn't ready to tell her or Chris about all the insanity I had been dealing with. I don't know. It's just, she seems like a different person. Rebecca, always the peacemaker, spoke in her usual calm tone. "People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you two just need to talk things through. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed." But I shook my head and replied in a low voice, a painful feeling tightening in my chest. "I think we're past that now. I don't think talking will help. I don't trust her anymore." The words hurt because I missed my wife, and I loved her. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear was not an appealing idea. Rebecca sighed. "Lynn loves you. She must be completely devastated." "I don't know that," I said. Rebecca shook her head sadly. "Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. This isn't like the Lynn I know." It took a full minute for her words to settle in my mind, and when they did, I felt terror creep through my skin. "Wait, what do you mean? You saw her?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually, as if this fact wasn't horrifying. Maybe to her it wasn't. "She came by this morning after Chris had already left for work," Rebecca said as she cleared the dishes from the table. "But I didn't see her car. Maybe she took an Uber or something." "Becca, what did she say? Did she come inside?" I asked, sweat beginning to form on my forehead. I started scanning the corners of the room, as if expecting a predator to be lurking behind them. "She just asked if you were awake yet, and I told her you weren't." I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. "She just told me to let you sleep," Rebecca said as she washed the dishes. "That's it? She didn't say anything else?" I pressed. "No, but she looked awful. Like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her." I stood up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt somewhat relieved knowing that Lynn hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that all the doors were locked. I sat for a while, trying to decide what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt like I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I vowed to love and honor her in sickness and in health? It was clear that she was very sick. If she was truly ill, and I was beginning to believe that more and more, then I had to at least try to get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and even if I did, what would I say? That my wife was stalking me? That she was acting creepy? Despite her bizarre behavior, she hadn't actually committed a crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably say I was overreacting, but this wasn't just some weird joke. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous. Like something sinister was lurking behind her smile. I knew that as her husband, I had the right to request a psychiatric hold. But what if she acted completely normal in front of them? Clearly, she had fooled Rebecca into thinking she was just a worried wife. As long as the doctors didn't see her as a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I waited until Chris got home, and after a long, exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn really needed psychological help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't ready to go into the details yet, but I told them about our last encounter, how she hid in the bathroom and watched me from inside the closet. They were, of course, shocked, but fortunately, they believed me. They also wanted to help her. However, they didn't think it was that serious. Strange, maybe, but not dangerous. They kept repeating that Lynn might have been playing some kind of weird prank. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca suggested, though hesitantly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. Instead, he offered to come with me, and I quickly accepted his offer. He argued that talking to her calmly and trying to convince her to go willingly was the best solution. I agreed to do it his way. At least, I wouldn't be going to that house alone. We went there this morning right after breakfast. There was no chance I was going at night. When we arrived at the driveway leading to the house, my stomach began to churn. Her car wasn't there, but I didn't let my guard down yet. The front door was slightly ajar, and for a moment, I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was trembling and starting to sweat. Chris, on the other hand, was calm. He waited for me to open the door, hands in his pockets, as if he were going for a stroll in the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit by the smell of mold. Chris smelled it too and followed me inside, covering his nose. "What do you use to clean the floors here, cow dung?" Chris muttered. "Shut up," I said, my eyes scanning everywhere for any sign of Lynn. The house was eerily quiet and dark, even though it was 10 in the morning. All the curtains were tightly shut, refusing to let in any sunlight. If I hadn't left just 2 days ago, I would have thought the house was abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking every possible hiding spot and calling her name every now and then. "Why are you looking under the couch?" Chris finally asked. "Aren't we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was an idiot. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up to check the bathroom and the spare bedroom. As we climbed, I heard the crunch of glass under my shoes, shards scattered across some of the steps. I noticed that one of our wedding photos, which had been hanging on the wall beside the staircase, was shattered. The frame was hanging crookedly, and the glass was completely broken. I stared at the photo, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the picture right after leaving the church, right after exchanging our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white dress. I gazed at Lynn's lovely face. I never imagined her face would become a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the stairs and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked exactly the same, untouched. I hesitated to enter the bathroom, as all my fears from that night came rushing back. Chris noticed and offered to go in alone, but I couldn't let him do that. So we went in together and checked the closet and the bathroom. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom to pack some clothes into a bag. When I opened our closet, I stumbled upon the source of the smell and almost vomited. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to stand by the stairs to escape the sight and the smell. I stared in shock at what was inside my bedroom closet. Embedded in the carpet were dozens of eyes, all carefully arranged in pairs. Some were as large as coins, while others were as small as marbles. I looked at the eyes she had collected from small animals and wondered how she had gotten them. A shiver running down my spine at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go. He called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any... His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. "Chris, run! Go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said. You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," I said, as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me. Still on the line with 911, I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us. But I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but, of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while, and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow, I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now, I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you." And a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. Mary was born in a black and white room, and scientists didn't let her see colors until she turned 18. She saw something we didn't. Mary's room, also known as the knowledge argument, is a philosophical concept concerning a hypothetical woman named Mary, who has never seen color. She has only ever existed in a black and white room. Mary studies the world through books and a monochromatic television screen. She reads about colors, but she does not experience them visually. Can the universe be fully understood in purely physical terms? The answer differs, depending on whether one believes that we know fundamental truths about reality a priori, without experience, or a posteriori, with experience. In other words, will Mary learn anything about color when she leaves the black and white room? It was a thought experiment. Nobody was supposed to actually do it. However, in 2007, a group of researchers sought to answer that question, and the experiment they conducted would have been condemned by boards of ethics across the globe. But these were not ethical scientists, and this was no ethical organization. I would have decried its actions back then. This wasn't why I joined the agency. But I was afraid. After all, they were willing to put an innocent baby in a colorless prison cell, doomed to grow up in near solitary confinement, save for a nurse dubbed Nanny. What would they have done to a whistleblower? I don't know how they found the baby, and I don't want to know. Whether a parent willingly gave her up, or one of the scientists intentionally bred her for the experiment, the result remains the same. A baby, named Mary, in honor of the philosophical concept which inspired the horrifying experiment, was placed in a white, windowless, foam-padded cell. She was blindfolded whenever her nurse entered the room to provide food, formula, and fresh clothes. Always the same black onesie, with coverings like mittens and socks to cover her hands and feet. She was also made to wear a facial covering, akin to a balaclava, which covered her face. There was no mouth slit to avoid her seeing the color of her lips, and she wore black contacts in her eyes. Equally, Nanny wore the exact same attire every time she entered the room. To put it simply, Mary's daily outfit was horrid, barely any more humane than a straitjacket and a bag over the head. There was no room for error. Mary was watched by at least one person at all hours of day and night. Should she get curious and try to sneak a peek at the color of her skin or eyes, she would receive 100 volts in the collar attached to her neck. But more terrifyingly than that was the simple fact that Mary was well trained. So well trained that she never, in her 18 years of imprisonment, even attempted to take a peek at her skin. She was such a willing prisoner, having never known anything else, that I think she would have stayed in her room even if the door had been standing ajar. This initially seemed excessive, given that copious measures had been taken to ensure no reflective surfaces would be allowed within the room. Even the television monitor was fitted with an anti-glare screen. However, scientists were paranoid that Mary might somehow catch a glimpse of her green eyes. Even seeing her pale, peach-colored skin would have dirtied the results of the experiment. Black and white. Those were the only shades that Mary was permitted to see, and when Mary started walking and talking, Nanny stopped entering the room entirely. Fresh food and clothes were delivered through a horizontal slit in the steel door, and Mary was always instructed to wear a blindfold before changing or using the bathroom, which comprised of a white porcelain toilet and a black shower head fixed to the foam wall. Revoltingly, both were exposed in that titchy room of hers. Her entire world was a box, stretching a mere 4 meters across all 3 dimensions. I wanted to save her numerous times over the years, wanted to leave that horrid place behind. But I'm a coward. Besides, we wouldn't have got far. There is no running from these people, and the agency isn't even the greatest horror of this story. On Mary's 18th birthday, Dr. Robson delivered a thrilling message over the speaker. "Happy birthday, Mary," he said in a monotone lacking empathy. "Thank you," the girl meekly responded. "Will there be chocolate cake this year?" I wasn't fond of the lemon last year, you see." "Today, we'll be celebrating in a different way, Mary," Robson replied. "Do you know your age? I'm 18, she croaked. "Does that mean—" "Yes, Mary," Dr. Robson said. "Today, you leave the room." "I'll see? Color?" she asked rather innocently. Any sane and well-developed human in the outside world would have simply been glad to have freedom, but Mary had no concept of freedom, no concept of a prison. She had no understanding that this childhood had been abnormal, worse than abnormal, inhuman. To keep Mary compliant, her schooling had been rigid, with books that purposefully omitted any dangerous ideas. The result of that? A girl relishing at the opportunity to not escape from her prison, but to simply see color. Yes, Mary, you will see color. Nanny is already on her way to fetch you, Dr. Robson said. We watched live footage, filmed on a closed-circuit camera, from our operational room. Nanny unlocked the weighty entrance to Mary's room, and we all waited with bated breath. Waited as Nanny aided Mary in removing her black headgear. I heard Mary giggling giddily and unnervingly, as the bag was removed from her head and the contacts were removed from her eyes. And then, as her first experience with a color other than black or white, Nanny removed her own black outfit to revealing a striking red dress beneath. Mary gasped. It was an intake of breath so sharp that she seemed to stop breathing. Perhaps, for a moment, she had stopped breathing. "What are you experiencing?" Dr. Robson asked. "Is it new? Does it feel like—" "I knew it," Mary whispered with vocal cords that sounded as if they were on the verge of snapping. Then her giggling picked up again, seeming to unnerve Nanny. "This is why you did the experiment, isn't it?" "Does this feel like a new experience, Mary?" Robson asked with a hint of impatience, seemingly oblivious to Nanny's discomfort. It was plainly clear to me, even through grainy camera footage. Mary shot her teary face up to the camera. "Yes, but I've been waiting for it." "Yes, I know that, Mary," Robson groaned. "But so have I. Tell me about it. Tell me about the red. How does it feel to experience true color for the first time? We're seeing some interesting brain activity on the screen here, but your words would really help us to—" "I'm not talking about the red," Mary interjected. And then she jabbed an accusatory finger at Nanny's dress in a way that frightened me. Certainly frightened Nanny, who jumped backwards. "I'm talking about that," she giggled. "I knew there was something you were leaving out of the books and TV shows over the years." "What are you saying, Mary?" Robson asked. "I don't understand." "Red. You're looking at red." "Red and the second color," she insisted. "The color you didn't describe in the books. None of the adjectives you've used describe this one. Red is just as stark, powerful, and passionate as described. The blue color of Nanny's eyes is as soothing and tender as described. But this other color on her dress is just—" "What other color?" Robson cried. "It's just red, Mary." "Right here!" Mary yelled as she lunged forwards and prodded Nanny in the abdomen. The woman in the red dress jumped backwards, clutching her stomach, and then Mary's eyes went wide. "Oh," she whimpered. "What, Mary?" Robson asked. "Please tell us what you're seeing." "What I saw," she whispered, moving her finger up to Nanny's face. "It moved up there, and now it's gone. Please describe this other color to us, Mary," Robson said, before putting an image up on Mary's television set. "Which one of those is it?" Mary's eyes shot to the television screen and quickly scanned the 12 main colors on the screen. "It's not one of those, not a different shade of one of those, it's a different color. There are 10 million possible permutations of colors, Mary," Robson said. "Perhaps you just—" "No, Dr. Robson," the girl interrupted, panting heavily as her eyes darted back to Nanny's face, studying it. "I understand how shades work. The shade of blue on the screen differs from the color of Nanny's eyes. But that other color, it wasn't included on the screen. It was—" Mary stopped and her eyes widened. Then she said, "I'm sorry." Nanny frowned. "That's okay, Mary. I know you didn't mean to." "Not you," Mary hissed, before leaning forwards and trying to look into Nanny's mouth. I'm sorry I saw you." "Mary, you're not making any sense," Dr. Robson said. "I think we've done enough for today. We'll do more tomorrow. So I wasn't supposed to see it," Mary moaned, shooting backwards, clunking into the foam wall, then seizing clumps of her straggly hair. Oh God, why don't you see it? It's Nanny. It's in you. Nanny looked up at the camera. I'd like to step outside now, Dr. Robson. Dr. Robson sighed, then pinched the bridge of his nose between two fingers. Fine, Nanny. Nanny had already spun on her heel to leave. She would have done so regardless of whether Robson gave her permission, as Mary was clearly disturbing her. But she barely took one step before her body fixed itself to the floor, and then Nanny juddered like a fleshy bobblehead. I was overcome by a warm sensation across my skin, and moments later there came a thunderous explosion. Skin flew into the walls from a red eruption of dress fragments, blood, and guts. Nanny had spontaneously imploded. Screams filled the operating room. Some fled, some fainted, and others simply froze. I don't even know whether any of them noticed it. Noticed Mary clawing out her eyes, leaving streaks of blood and tears across her cheeks as, mere minutes after seeing color for the first time, she ensured that she would never see anything else ever again. "I'm sorry," the eyeless woman wailed. "I didn't know I wasn't allowed. Please, I'll never see you again." As I saw a trail of blood run from Nanny's destructed corpse towards the front door, clearly painted by something unseen, a deep dread filled my chest. I realized that my fleeing colleagues had the right idea, so I followed, fled in fear, leaving Dr. Robson and my frozen co-workers behind. I don't remember leaving the building, getting in my car, and going home, but I must have done those things. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be posting this for all of you. It's been 4 hours since Mary saw color for the first time, saw a color that none of us saw. What was it? Why could only Mary see,